I feel very, very honored to be here, and hopefully I'll leave a message. My whole message really is about tolerance and hope. I came to the conclusion that the only way we could do something about it is to fight prejudice wherever it is. Otherwise, we don't have much hope for us. Anyway, I'll start with my own testimony. When the war broke out in 1939, I was like 9 years old. But I remember everything just about what took place. I remember the political things that were happening. I remember just about all the things were taking place when Germany started saber rattling and going to war. I lived in a small town in the Carpathians. We had my family consisted of 9 children and my parents. We consider ourselves very lucky at the time because Czechoslovakia was the only Eastern European country that had democracy. And even at that age, I knew, like I was in 3rd, 4th grade, I knew what democracy meant. In 3rd grade already, the teachers used to give us lessons in voting. And I always look back at that because I always thought that we were so backward, but in some ways we were actually ahead of some places because they made us aware of democracy. Anyway, get back to 1939 when the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, I should say, that part. It consisted of Slovakia and the Carpathians, which was, now it's under Ukraine. But when the Nazis took over Prague, or the Czech Republic, they gave the spoils of war to the Hungarians because the Hungarians were allies. And as soon as they came in, even at that age, I knew right away that there was a whole change in atmosphere. Everybody was gloomy and everybody was sad. The population where we lived, was mostly Russian. Not Russian like you find in Moscow, but they were sort of European Russian. And the population in general always wanted to have autonomy from the Czechs. However, the Czech government, I remember even as a kid, they built schools, they were building roads, they tried to modernize the country. And for some reason, a lot of people were not exactly for it. They wanted the status quo, or some of them objected even their kids going to school. But at any rate, when the Hungarians came in, they immediately started copying of all the Nuremberg laws that the Nazis established in Germany. And whatever the Nazis or the Germans did in Germany, the Hungarians were going in step. They fell into step and doing the same thing. They set up scary police tactics. They arrested people without cause. They took away businesses and houses from, in this particular case, mostly Jewish people, and gave it to some of their own patrons. However, my parents said it shouldn't be so bad because my parents were old enough, they remember from prior to World War I, where they lived under the Austria-Hungarian Empire, and he says, well, the Hungarians weren't so bad, so it shouldn't be much of a problem. However, we soon found out by 1940, 41, that each year that passed, they were getting worse and worse. The first thing they did, about 1940, they inducted all the Jewish men, military age, which was like from about 20 to 45, and they tucked them into what they call labor battalions. And the rest of the people, they mobilized into the army. Now the Jewish fellows were put into labor battalions, and they were using them for cutting down the forests so the partisans couldn't hide. They were using them for all kind of slave labor, And on the Russian front, they took out most of them to the Russian front, and they, in fact, including my two oldest brothers. And they spent all the way through the war on the, in that area. And they used those people for picking minefields, burying the dead, and details of such. However, if one of them would escape, they dealt with it very harshly. They took the whole units on a field, they lined them up and counted 1 to 10, and every 10 person was shot. This was not the Germans, this was the Hungarians. And the reason I point this out, because very often when people write history, they omitting, to me, is just as bad as if they misrepresented it. And because we always talk about the Germans, what the Germans did, but everybody leaves out the people that were the helpers or the participants. And I could go on and go from country to country. Wherever the Nazis occupied during World War II, whatever country, every single country, they had a lot of people that were willing participants and were doing exactly the same thing. However, when the war was over, everybody claimed they were victims, okay? And I'd like to put that straight, that that's not always the way it is. That people, instead of helping, instead of fighting evil, they would go out and actually participate in it. Getting back to my family, so like I said, we lived in this town, and about 1942 or so, we kept on, 41, 42, we kept on hearing of atrocities in Poland and the Ukraine, because over there they had a heavy Jewish population. Like in Poland, they had like 3.5 million Jewish people living, and Ukraine also was they had very large population, and Lithuania and so on. And we kept on hearing of killing squads going from town to town and killing people. And as we heard it, and I remember even though I was very young, none of us could quite understand or accept it, even though we believed it, and we knew what was happening, because we figured the Germans were Germans. I mean, they were sophisticated, they were more educated than anybody else, and they had a so-called democracy. How in the world could that happen? However, like I say, about 1941 or 42, they picked up a certain amount, select people, Jewish families, and they put them in boxcars and shipped them out to the Ukraine. Now, at that time, the Germans were deep into Russia already. They took them out and they dropped them off in the forests of the Ukraine. And I'm talking about women, children, whole families, old, young. And a lot of people in our area or throughout that part of the world, frankly, people didn't have much. They were fairly poor. They didn't even have decent luggage. But all they had was like sheets or a tablecloth. They put some utensils or whatever in there for the family needs. They took them out to Ukraine in these boxcars. And by the way, during World War II, the winters were severe, some of the coldest winters of in years. And they dropped them off in the forests of the Ukraine, and then they were left on their own in the deep snow with poor clothing and no shelter, no place to go. And they had a problem. First of all, they were in a very cold climate, no food, so they would wander. And as they wandered, the Ukrainians themselves were very anti-Semitic. Consequently, they would chase them from place to place. They had no place to hide or no place to go. In the meantime, whenever they were on the road, in this particular case, I'll talk about the Hungarians because that's where a lot of people I knew were, so I have like firsthand evidence of it. They would take some of the Hungarian troops, and of course the Germans also, they took women. I mean, when the people were, like during wartime, first of all, let me establish this. During wartime, people, whenever you have like a crossroad or a bridge, there are sentries. And wherever they went, they would run into the sentries. And the sentries would stand near a bridge. Usually it's with a ravine or a river below it. They would take tear away the children from the mother, and literally bashed them in, and then throw them into the river while the mother was begging. And only then they would throw the mother in. Other things they did that were not as severe, a lot of Jewish people in that time in that area had beards because they were Orthodox. They would take a bayonet and cut their beard just to make them, to humiliate them. Or they would take a match and light the beard on fire. And those are the stories we kept on hearing. Then later on, we heard that in Warsaw, they were putting people on a truck, on a military truck, put a canvas on it, and piping the gas from the truck, the exhaust into the back of the truck, and they would drive around the city until they got suffocated. So hearing this, we were prepared for just about everything. However, for the time being, they left us alone. They took out all the people from farther, like from Poland and all, but the Hungarian Jews, somehow they left us alone for the time being. Even though they took away our civil rights and so on, but we were still able to function. Then as late as 1944, when they were losing the war already, they decided, they went over and they tried to make a deal with the Hungarian government to give up the Jews to them, to ship them out. And there was a change in the government by then, and they said, oh, sure. And they sent Eichmann. I don't know if you heard of him, but Eichmann was a very, very capable negotiator. And they thought they'll have to make some kind of promises or deals with the Hungarians. But instead, they found, to their surprise, the Hungarians said, oh, you want them? Sure. So the Nazis didn't, the Germans didn't pick us up. The Hungarian police came, they rounded everybody up. In 2 months, they rounded up 600,000 people in Hungary. I'm talking about women, children, even sick. And they shipped them out to Auschwitz. To show you to what extent they went, I had one uncle, he was in a sanitarium, he had TB. And they picked him up on a stretcher. They would not leave anybody behind, okay? No children, no nothing. And if somebody was, went into hiding, they didn't last long. There was only one family I know went into hiding. They were very brave, and they took, in our area, and they had nice, handsome, a couple of sons and 2 daughters, and another few people, and they went into hiding, and they found them at almost the very end of the war, and they took them naked. They put chains around them and marched them through one town to another to a stable someplace, and then they shot them. Okay, just to give you an idea of the severity or the, how can I put it? I can't describe the nastiness or that they were capable of doing, and this is really my problem. Anyway, so in 1944, they picked all the Hungarian Jews, like I said, in 2 months, shipped everybody out to Auschwitz. Now, we knew that we were in for big trouble because by now we heard all the stories. But we still somehow couldn't believe that this is for real. Anyway, they put us in boxcars, about 125 to 135 people in a boxcar, without food, water, or toilet facilities. By the time we came to Auschwitz, a lot of people died because they were old or literally out of exhaustion. When we came to Auschwitz, it was late at night. It was like about 11, 12 o'clock at night. We pulled into the camp. Now, we had no idea where we were. All we knew we were east. We knew we were in Poland because we passed some stations. We recognized the towns or the cities. As soon as they opened the doors, all bedlam, all the hell broke loose, like was bedlam. They started, there were some guys in striped clothes running around with sticks. Heraus, heraus, schnell, get out fast. And they would force us to get out as fast as, as possible from the train. Later on, we found out they were capos or other prisoners, but they had white clothing, striped clothing, which we later got ourselves. But anyway, they pushed us out of the train. We gathered there on an empty space. And all of a sudden, we were surrounded by guards with their finger on a trigger every few feet. And I could never understand why, because the camp was electrified, and it was had like not one fence, but it was fence after fence. So there was hardly a chance to escape. But they lined us up, and the first thing they did is separate men from the women. And by the way, they had floodlights, and while the guards were scary enough, but they also had German police dogs, those real nasty dogs trained to kill, around, also surrounding us. Now you could imagine how scared we were. We had no, really, we were really, really scared. If you could ever picture anybody scared. As we separated the men from, they separated men from the women, there was Dr. Mengele, which was a sharp uniform with a, what do you call, of course at that time I didn't know who he was, but later on we found out who he was. He would just stand there with his sharp boots and a sharp uniform and just go like this or like that. And we knew, we were told to always tell them that we were willing to work, that they were looking, that they were, didn't like sophisticated, educated people, but they liked workers. So we all were prepared to tell them that if they ask you, what did you do? You're a farmer or so on, which by the way, which was not a lie in our case, because my father had a business, but he also farmed, so we were used to that. And I wasn't that big. I was like just about 15 years old. And so I put on about 3 jackets, and I went through the line, and I passed. But at the time, we didn't know what the penalty was for not passing through the line. When we passed through the line, they took us to a shower, into a downstairs in a basement, and we had to shed our clothes. And they had barbers there with shears, and they showed everybody's hair off, of course. But the older men, like they have body hair and stuff, they even shaved that off. And we went through, we took a shower, we came out on the other side, and we also got issued these striped clothes with wooden shoes. Now I was lucky, I got a pair of wooden shoes. They had like a plastic covering over them, and that was very, very lucky, because many of them didn't even get that. They had shoes that were you take like sandals, you take to the beach like with a little cloth, a little canvas over the top, and they, some of them got shoes like the Dutch, with a hollowed out wood, like the Dutch shoes. And this is in Eastern Europe and harsh, cold winters, you can imagine. But we came out on the other side, and we didn't even recognize each other. Now this was in the spring of 1944, and the reason I'm going to mention this, you would think in the spring the weather is already good. Well, let me tell you, in Auschwitz, in the spring of 1944, the weather was miserable, cold, nasty, drizzling. You couldn't even see a bird in the air. I didn't think of it at the time, but with hindsight, I remember you couldn't even see anything alive. Everything, and all we saw is we were put in a barrack for overnight by 12 people per bunk. In the morning, they chased us out like about 5 o'clock in the morning or so. We had to go out, and it was, like I say, very, very cold. So cold that we were shivering, especially those striped uniforms had the weight of pajamas. So you can imagine. So about 15, 20 of us would sort of push together so we could keep ourselves from shivering. In the meantime, we saw these chimneys, tall chimneys with smoke, very, very black smoke coming out of the chimneys. And we didn't know what it was. We soon found out it was called a crematorium. And we found out that all the people, all our families, were already going up in smoke by then. This was already by next morning. So in the meantime, because of the heavy shipments of people were coming in from Hungary, the capacity of the crematoriums couldn't handle it. So what did they do? They had not far from us, like actually maybe like 500 yards away, there was some trees, and there was big flames coming up, like the trees were pine trees, so they were tall, and they were going all the way up as tall as the pine trees. And we also smelled flesh burning, and obviously the reason was simple. And then we found out what happened to our families by next morning. And that was our awakening, where we were and what it was all about. And the reason they used those pits, they stacked up people like firewood and poured fluid over them like in a ditch and just kept on burning. And they were so sophisticated that they were figured out that per 1 shift, for instance, how many people will be consumed by fire because of the fat burning of the people. I know it sounds horrid, but this is the way, how sophisticated it was. When, in my particular case, I was lucky. I was only there about a week or 10 days, and one day we got orders, we were going on a transport. So my father, by the way, while we were out there gathered, immediately I had an older brother. He was a healthy, strong fella. He was about 7 years older than I was. And he was separated from us immediately. One thing they were doing, always try to inflict as much pain to you as possible. The first thing they tried to do is break everybody up so that no families stay together. But somehow my father and myself stayed together, and I had one uncle and a cousin, actually 2 cousins, that we were grouped together in one group. So we were put on this transport to go to Mauthausen. Now Mauthausen too was a very large camp, infamous camp, a very, very huge camp actually, and it was in Austria. So we were going to, on this transport to Austria, and all along we couldn't believe that they're going to say that our lives are safe. But then we started reasoning. We figured that wherever they'll take us, they'll probably kill us. But then we tried to reason a little bit. Well, if they could have killed us there, why would they take us someplace else? Anyway, we got to Austria, and the train finally stopped at the side of this huge mountain. It turned out to be, it was a stone quarry. They marched us up to the top of the mountain, and on top of the mountain there was this camp called Mauthausen. Now Mauthausen was different than Auschwitz in many respects. However, Mauthausen had about 40 subcamps, okay? And the work in Mauthausen, people that stayed in Mauthausen worked in the stone quarry, and by the way, they didn't use machines. They had to use picks and shovels to cut out rock from the mine and pull them up like donkeys with carts. So, they had like tracks, lay tracks, and they moved the rocks up the mountain. But Mauthausen was also known as to be very big on political prisoners. And by the way, we all had markings why we were there. So like in our case, we had a little triangle, a red triangle that was considered political. And there were a lot of Czechs, because the Czech Republic was next door, so a lot of Czech political prisoners died here by the thousands. But for sake of time, I'll just give you, I'm not going to go into detail too much about the camp itself. From there, by the way, they shipped us out to another subcamp. It was called Melk, which was also not too far from, it was between Mauthausen and Vienna, about 60 kilometers from Vienna. And this Melk was a beautiful little town. You would not believe it. It's a picturesque town with little castles in the hills and churches. And the Danube was floating today. That's a tourist attraction. This particular camp was fairly new, from what we could tell. But it was a camp set up for a workforce to facilitate. They were building a tunnels under a big mountain several miles away. And our job was to build these tunnels. So we were building 7 tunnels simultaneously. depending on your shift, I'll just give you an idea of the daily task that we encountered every day. If you got up in the morning, about 4 o'clock in the morning, you got issued a cup of a broth. It was made out of sugar beet that in Germany, they used to use that for cattle. You know, it was if you eat it, it's so sweet, it has a certain taste that it actually makes you sick. But anyway, they made like a tea out of it. That was our ration for the morning, with a chunk of bread, which by the way was made mostly out of sawdust, but nevertheless it was bread. And we would go out to the field, and in order for us to get to work, they built a trestle on an open field so that you could climb up the steps to this trestle and wait for the train. And the reason I mentioned about the trestle, when you got up there during the winter especially, it was windy and cold, and we were way up high. You could imagine we had these clothes that were made like pajamas. And we had to stand at attention until the train came. And this was the same thing, going and coming. When we got to work, some of us worked outside laying tracks. Some of them worked in a tunnel with air hammers. And we had to push constantly to get more. If we achieved X amount of meters one day, they wanted more next day. And this was constant. So people were dying left and right, just out of mere exhaustion. And I remember when we marched to the train, I remember I was so sleepy and so tired. And I remember literally kicking the person in the front of me, but because I would doze off while I was walking. When for lunch they would bring out food. It would be a soup, and most of the time you would get this what they call durgamisa, which was dehydrated vegetables. And I remember the smell of it was enough to make you sick, even though we were very hungry. But he had all to do to pass the smell because it was so hard. And during the summer, what they would do is give us spinach soup every single day for weeks, the sand and all. And obviously, we were in poor condition. We were suffering from malnutrition. I don't have to tell you what the spinach did to a lot of people. So we were losing people that way, like daily. Having the spinach soup sometime for 2-3 days, and the 4th day you died out of dehydration. Then they had, after that, in the summer, we had carrots, but with the tops. Now, most of you buy carrots in a package. It's all nice and clean. The carrots we got were with the tops and all. Now, carrots, when they're grown in a natural fashion without our sophisticated growing in the United States, they're very bitter. But they chopped up the greens and all. And I remember that soup was so bitter and so hard to swallow, but if you have no food, you ate that too. So it just gives you an idea. This was a daily routine. On the way home, oh, by the way, each time when you went out, to work or from work, they would count us time and time again. We were such prized possession by them. They didn't care if anybody died, but God forbid that somebody should be missing. And occasionally, because we were so tired, somebody would fall asleep in the tunnel and in some crevice. And naturally, they would, instead of letting us go home after working all this time, they would keep us there in the sun or the heat. It didn't matter, rain, 4 or 5 hours sometimes till they found that person. And when they found him, of course, they would beat him to death practically. Okay, not always. But it just gives you an idea. This was the type of life you lived. And during the winter months, we had a population of about 12,000, 13,000 in this particular camp. During the winter months, every single month, we had a replacement of about 3,000 people, I remember. It was like we lost like 600 to 700 people a week, okay, and during the winter months. In the summer, oddly enough, it dropped off quite considerably, only like about maybe 70. So it just gives you an idea how precarious it was. From there, while we were going through this, and by the way, I'll just give an idea. Another thing, let's say you were in the afternoon shift, you went through the same thing. However, like I said, we were always very cold, and it was windy. Like I said, we have to stand on a trestle. It was very windy and cold. So we worked with cement. And by the way, all the stuff we did mostly was by plain labor, not very little machines. So some of the fellas figured they'll take the cement bag, which, by the way, you can imagine, put cement bag on your body. As it is, we were not very clean. Actually, we're not, we're dirty. But put the cement bag, because that was acted like a windbreaker under your jacket. And the lager commandant would come in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning when we returned from work, okay, stand at the gate and have the guards check every person going through the gate if they have these cement bags underneath. If they would have them, the one they were caught, they would take them and give them 25 lashes with a bullwhip. Now this bullwhip was nothing to sneeze at. This was the Gestapo's used to have. They all loved the bullwhip. They would walk around with a bullwhip this long, and it was like a really, really. If you got hit with that, you know you were hit. And believe it or not, they had a special crew of people. And oddly enough, until this day, I don't know the reason. And those people, by the way, were Spaniards. But they had a good life. They were fed well. They were in good condition. They had tailor-made the same uniform because they were prisoners. They had a different marking. And they were, the people, they were just plainly used just for giving out lashes. And until this day, I don't know why that worked that way. By the way, I must tell you this too. While we were in Melk, we were, so far we were thinking about Jewish people, okay? I want you to understand, even though the Holocaust or the killing of the gas chambers were for Jews, but other people were there as well. Like in Melk, we were all mixed. There were lots of Greeks, Italians, Poles, Ukrainians, you name it. Every country that the Nazis or the Germans were in, they were represented there. When I lost my thought. They were, like I said, we were a mixed society. There were people from every country and just about in Europe. And we were all treated the same, by the way, when we were there. We're not singled out Jewish or otherwise. In fact, there were a lot of Germans there because the Germans were political prisoners. But looking at the jacket, I could tell why he was there. And a lot of them were in for different, a lot of them were political. Some were there for robbery, murder, or larceny, whatever. But we all recognized each other by the marks. And I remember some of them, our capo, for instance, from our barrack was in for murder. And I remember, like, we all tried to stay away from him. We were so afraid of him, okay? So, because murder to us was not like today. We see it on television. It happens almost daily. But we were not used to that. Anyway, this was basically the routine, and this went on from, and by the way, when you came out on a night shift, if you came out back like from work, what they would do, once a week we would have to line up, and a barber would have to cut our hair, and even instead of going to sleep, we were dog tired. We would come in, like, say, 2 o'clock in the morning, and it would take like 3-4 hours because the lines were long till the barber cut our hair close. Then they would take a razor and shave off in the middle of a stripe, right, from front to back. But in case anybody escaped, they would be caught easily, okay? Not that you could escape because we were really very well guarded. In fact, there were a few attempts while I was in Melk, but they would catch them with no time at all because they would go out with, the SS would go out with dogs. And of course, there was no place to hide because how do you know who would shelter you, or how could you have a chance? You would have to get new clothes. You'd have to get, and it was, if you didn't speak perfect German, they would detect you immediately. So it was not easy. And when they would catch them, they would bring them back to camp, and they would force us to go out. Everybody, even the people that are in infirmary, which were not too many because they never lasted long, they would bring everybody out to watch the hanging of the person. And this is the way life was. Anyway, I'll jump ahead. It was coming in beginning of, in 1945, actually, I found out my father had died, supposedly of pneumonia. But I only found out several days later because we were in different units when we went to work, and we lived in a different part of the camp. And then I also had a cousin that also died there. But one cousin was in my barrack, and we were together almost to the end. But then we kept on hearing that the Russians were coming into Hungary. They were already in Hungary, and we started getting cheering about it. But we didn't know what's going to happen to us. In the meantime, American planes were coming in, like bombers were coming in daily. There are certain periods. And I remember we were all very excited. They would come in, 40, 50 bombers would come in broad daylight, and almost every day at noon, or you could set your clock by it. And they would go by high up in the air, and just the noise was so, it was like music to our ears. We figured, well, this is really, something is happening. They're already beating them. In the meantime, they, somehow the English had a bomb run, and they made a mistake. We had a big barrack, the barrack I happened to be in. All the other barracks were like army barracks. The barrack I was in was a big building. It used to be a warehouse for ammunition warehouse prior to they turned it into a camp. Well, somehow the British intelligence never figured it out that it was a concentration camp. And one day they came in, and by the way, this I must tell you, I was working in this tunnel in this unit, and this one morning they needed a certain amount of people for a detail, and they grabbed me. They needed extra people to go on a detail to work on some kind of, I don't remember exactly what we did, about 3 kilometers away from the camp, in a field. And we loved it because it was a beautiful day, and we were able, actually, we were really in grass, and it was just nice. It was a nice spring day. And all of a sudden, these bombers came in, and they bombed this building that we slept in, and the whole night shift, which was about 600 people, were all incinerated by these bombs. They dropped like about 15 bombs on that building. So it just shows you how lucky you were. And another incident I had, like I was working in the tunnels, and this one time I worked the night shift, and we finished like about 8 o'clock in the morning, and about 7:30 or so, I decided I had to go to the bathroom. So I went outside to the latrine, and I just went, and by the way, there was no loafing. You had to go and come right back. I went to the latrine. By the time I was returning, there was heavy smoke coming out of the tunnel. Again, about 70 people died of smoke inhalation because they had these big cables, those BX cables, and it caught on fire, and it created such smoke that they, 60, 70 people sophisticated. Some of them were lucky. They, because once all we had was naked light bulbs, and when the smoke got heavy, you couldn't see any light at all. But we had a conveyor belt that was taking out the sand that we dug out of the tunnel, and some of them dropped on a conveyor belt, and it brought them out, and that's how they were saved. So it gives you an idea how life was, and this happened daily. There was always something like this happening. So now, as time was running out, we heard the Hungarians and the Germans were retreating into Austria or Germany, and the Russians were pushing very hard. What happened now is they took us suddenly from Melk back to Mauthausen. In Mauthausen, as soon as we got there, things were very bad already because even the German troops didn't have food. So our rations came down to practically nothing. We got like a half a pint of this broth I mentioned to you, and the bread that we did get, if you were strong enough to get in line, it was, again, sawdust but full of mildew. You could actually see the blue mildew in the thing. We had to put our hands up like this in a palm, and that's the only way you got a few crumbs. And the people that were too weak couldn't even get that. But the first thing they did, one of the things they did right away, they separated out the Jews from the non-Jews. And that scared us, because we figured if they do this, we are definitely going to be killed, okay? So what they did, they pulled us out of the main camp, and they put us on the side of the mountain, which was like a very neglected piece of real estate, which had like a lot of thorn bushes and all kind of stuff that you couldn't even find a place to sit down. But anyway, they put us there, and we were sure that they're going to kill us very soon. After being there a couple of weeks, I don't remember exactly how long, one day we got an order to be going on a march. We had no idea where. And a very funny thing happened. I remember, even though we were very tired and very weak and we were very hungry, all of a sudden I had like some light went out on my head, and I felt, gee, I think it's going to be better. Don't ask me why, because we had no hope at all. And we started on a march. The march, we had to march us all the way across Austria. And we came to a place called Gunskirchen. Gunskirchen was looked like a new camp, and with quite a lot of people there. There were like about 14 or 15,000 people from, I remember at the time, at least that's the number I heard. And they brought us in there, but it looked like a new camp. But they only had like a few barracks. And by that time, the food was even less and less. So when we marched, if somebody fell down or something like this, they would just take the rifle and just shoot them, just like that. And I remember one incident, for instance, there was a potato on the ground as we were marching. And like when a wagon passed by, he dropped the potato. And there's one fella saw the potato, and he jumped for the potato. Another fella saw it at the same time, so they both jumped for the potato. One of the guys got the potato, and they started fighting over the potato. And the guard just took his rifle, aimed at his face, and just shot him right in the face, all because they were fighting over a potato. One guy, when there were alfalfa fields like on the side of the road, and he ran just a little bit into the ditch, like to get this grass. The same thing. So anybody that fell down because he couldn't walk, they were just shot and left like a dog. Finally, we got to Gunskirchen, but they put us, there the food was like practically nil. And I remember, one of the things that I remember, to talk about going to the limit, there was an SS officer, very sharp, tall again, but he had a couple of big black dogs, very fierce-looking dogs. And every so often he would come out and look out on the steps and just let the dog loose at somebody, just like this for fun, to tear them apart. Like I mentioned, there were not too many barracks. They put us 5,000 people in a barrack overnight, okay? And once you were in the barrack for the night, you had to we couldn't move. I mean, we walked in, we're like sardines standing up. And I was younger, so I was able to sort of like maneuver a little bit. I was crouched, and this is the way you survived the night. Next morning, they had lots of bodies because they would either get suffocated or they were too weak to move. To show you how bad things really were by that time, almost ashamed to say it, but lots of people, this was in a forest, and there was sometimes heavy rain, and they left puddles. And there were some people would inevitably walk into those puddles, and they would get stuck, and they would hold out their hand, barely raise their hand for help. And believe it or not, we walked by and not even helped him. And he said to himself, how could you do this? At the time, he thought we were doing him a favor, because if he died, he was finished. He was out of his misery. So we didn't even bother. So just to imagine. But at any rate, soon after that, while I was in this particular camp, we got liberated. And the Americans came in, but we didn't see any Americans. So we found out we were liberated. We were afraid to walk out of the camp. Oh, yes, and I must bring this in. While I came to this place, Gunskirchen, out of nowhere, those Hungarian labor battalions I mentioned to you, my brothers were in. I had cousins that were in it, and there's one cousin of mine, which, by the way, I was with his brother in Melk the whole time, but we got separated when we were evacuated. I come to this camp, and first, as soon as I get to this camp, who do you think I ran into? My cousin, his brother. He was there with 3 of his buddies. They were in pretty good shape. They they were only in, like, for a short time. They marched them from Hungary into, and they threw them into this camp, and we met there. You would talk about miracles. This was it. And they were in pretty good shape. They had their own shoes, and they still had their own clothes. So they were pretty, like I say, compared to us, we were like practically dead, but they were in pretty good shape. So that was a very lucky turn for me. So when we found out we were liberated, we didn't believe it. We thought it was a trick. As we walk out the gate, they'll machine gun us and they'll kill us. So we stayed out over the extra night till we marched out the following morning, and we realized we were safe. Because all the time we didn't see an American soldier. We just heard about it. So what happened in the meantime, it seems, the afternoon before, the lager, all the other guards that were guarding us ran off, but they brought in some new guards with a new officer, and they were in charge of watching us. So this new captain decided, he took a couple of elders from the camp, and he took a jeep. He went out to meet the Americans. And he showed them he had orders he was supposed to kill us, but he chose not to. So in the meantime, he was literally saved his own skin too. So this is the way we were saved, that we were not killed. So our assumption that we were going to be killed was not exactly out of order. Anyway, we found out we were liberated. So now the first thing was to go look for food. Like I mentioned, those 3 guys were in fairly good shape, and I strung along with them. I went along with them because of my cousin. And one of the fellas found an uncle of his. He was like in his 50s, but to us he was an old man, because very few people over 50, 55 were alive, okay? Just like there were nobody under my age, there was nobody over that age, because most people didn't survive that long. Anyway, we started looking for food, and we found a abandoned train from the Germans abandoned, and they had, we had a hard time breaking in. We had nothing to break it in with, but somehow we took a rock, broke the lock on a train. Anyway, we found a bunch of canned goods, like liverwurst and Spam, you know, those kind of things. But we didn't have a can opener, okay? But somehow we opened the can of liverwurst, and I remember for years afterwards, I couldn't tolerate the smell of liverwurst. And liverwurst, by the way, is very greasy and fat, and we were not allowed to have fat and grease because because that would kill you. But it was food, so we took a little taste of it. Luckily, we had enough sense; we didn't eat too much of it. Anyway, as we went a little further, we were on this field, like it was farmland, and we saw this abandoned German truck, army truck. And it was sort of in a ditch, but in a field. And we went over to the truck to examine it, and we saw this tub of lard in the front seat. And like I mentioned, these guys were in fairly good shape. He just took his fist and went right through the window. And all the glass fell into this lard. But we wanted a lard, because it has something to do with food. So we took our hands, and in the palm of our hands, we scooped out the glass, and we saved the lard. Then we looked in the back of the truck, and we found a bunch of leather hides. Now, these leather hides were all refined already, and we knew there wouldn't be any shoes to be bought, because the war, we knew there wouldn't be any shoes for love or money to buy or anything. So we figured we'll take these hides, go to a shoemaker, and have ourselves shoes made. We'll need shoes. So each one of us rolled up a few of those hides, as many as we could carry, which was not many because we were in poor condition. And we left the truck. We went on a march looking for food. So we saw this farmhouse, and our destination was the farmhouse. We got to the farmhouse, and by the way, now we were liberated, and we were angry. We were mad. We hated Germans. I cannot tell you if there's such thing as hate. We had it. We came to the farmhouse, and we knocked on the door. Now, mind you, here we were angry, we were bitter, we were everything. To us, a German was a Nazi, and a Nazi was a German. There was no distinction. This lady opens the door, a crack, and here are these big guys in fairly good shape, didn't push her in, didn't demand. One of the guys asked her if she could give us some eggs and flour, and she obliged. Now, she also had a barn in the backyard, and she had one of those kettles that the cowboys, like in the movies, you see, you make a fire under it, you put water in it, and you boil food or whatever. We made a fire under this kettle, and one of the fellas took the eggs and the flour and the lard, mixed it up, and made dumplings. And that was our first meal. And to show you how, in what kind of condition it was in, this older guy, this fellow's uncle, had a little too much. By next day, he died. He just couldn't tolerate the food. Meantime, after we finished eating, that was our first meal, and we were very content. One of the fellows suggested that we take some of the hides and give it to the lady in payment. And we knocked on the door, we gave it to the lady in payment. And nobody in the group objected. We all did it automatically. Well, the reason I'm mentioning, because I was speaking for several years, and I never remembered this at all. It was like shoved in the back of my mind. I forgot all about it. Then one day it hit me. And the reason I like to tell everybody now, in spite of the way we were, and believe me, didn't feel like human beings. We were about as dehumanized as a human being can get. But when push came to shove under this condition, we behaved like human beings. And all of a sudden it hit me that I should really tell about this. And until this day, it amazes me. I still can't understand why we behaved like this. And the only reason I could give you is that all of us were brought up, actually we were all Orthodox, we were religious practicing Jews in that part. And we were brought up with certain ethics and values. Even though we were full of hate and full of vengeance, yet we behaved like human beings. Until this day, as I say it, I still can't understand it. For the sake of time, I think I'm going to stop here, but I would like to close, give you something I wrote I would like to also mention. First of all, I would like to thank you. Thank you all for being here and listening to my testimony. For 50 years, I kept silent about the Holocaust. After I moved to Washington, D.C., and visited the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, I remembered that I made a promise to myself while in camp that if I survived, I would have to speak out of what happened so that this doesn't happen again. It's also very important that deniers of the Holocaust don't succeed. The 6 million that were murdered in the most brutal fashion by one of the most modern and enlightened countries at the time, that gave us famous philosophers and scientists, were also capable of the most dastardly acts in history. This act that was perpetuated against Jews and other minorities was not about them. It was an atrocity against mankind. All the men, women, and children killed have no gravesite markers. Instead, we have the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum that serves as a living memorial and is used as a teaching tool to stop bigotry and hate. Even today, there are groups and countries that teach hate to children, often in the name of religion. No wonder we have terrorists and suicide bombers. In Hebrew scriptures, there's a saying, and I quote, Tikkun Olam, to repair the world. We as human beings have an obligation to do that. Very often I'm asked if I wanted vengeance after the war. The answer is no. Vengeance destroys you as well as the enemy. My vengeance is that I survived and I have a good wife and 2 wonderful children and 4 beautiful grandchildren. That is my vengeance. I also like to applaud you, the audience, for caring and trying to eradicate hate and tolerance from our society. We must do that to save our children and ourselves. That is why I am very proud, as all of us should be, that in the the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum does that. And that is a credit to all Americans. Thank you very much.
Time for a few questions. Please.
Mr. Weiss, how and when were you able to come to the United States?
I came to the United States very early, right after the war. I came in 1946. I was very fortunate and lucky. I had a sister here in the United States that, believe it or not, left 2 weeks before the Hungarian occupation. Had she not left 2 weeks before that, I would not be here probably. I would be somewhere else. And because of her, my older sister somehow, I had no idea of her address or anything like this. My older sister somehow found her, and she was able to get us an affidavit from one of the richer relatives here in the States. And so we were able to come out rather quickly. Yes?
Mr. Weiss, I want to ask you the following question. When exactly did you arrive at Mauthausen? Was it in the fall of 1944?
No.
When they transported you from Auschwitz-Birkenau to Mauthausen?
No, I came to Mauthausen earlier. I came to Mauthausen in the spring of 1944.
Because it's a very exceptional situation in one sense. Because the Nazis at that moment needed working force, especially in Austria.
Yeah.
When in your little resume here, it's quoted the tunnels.
Yeah.
The tunnels were for making weapons, secret weapons,
Right.
that you were doing this time.
Well, no, actually, no. The tunnels were not necessarily, I don't know what they were going to use for. I knew they were going to use for setting up factories underground, basically so they wouldn't be bombed.
So it's a very exceptional situation
Yeah.
you were going through.
Yeah.
The fact
Right.
that half of your family was sent to Mauthausen with you,
Yeah.
your father, and
Yeah, right.
And just a little question now. When you arrived in Mauthausen, were you taken a picture for?
No.
No,
No, I
you
don't.
were not taking pictures.
No, I don't recall that.
Because many of our community were there, the Spaniards. Maybe did
Yeah.
you see the triangles, the blue triangles?
The blue, right. The Spanish had blue. Right,
Right.
right.
I belong to this.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
The son of this.
The funny thing is, I remember the blue. That's why I said that they used them for what do you call it, for the lashing. I didn't see too many Hispanics. The only one Hispanic I remember seeing is the one with the blue that they were used for that, and they were not. I didn't see many. Now Italians, I saw many. Okay, Greeks, I saw many. All right, but at that time, you have to remember, because we were in a situation we were, I was not concerned about these things. You know, it just so happened by coincidence I knew the markings of every person, you know.
And were you sent to the stone camp for the beating?
Where?
Mauthausen, in the pit where
No,
you go for
no.
the stone.
No, I didn't go. No, like I say, I was in Melk most of the time. See, I didn't work in Mauthausen at all. Okay, I was just there beginning and on the end. Yeah. Yes, you're welcome. Yes.
During this, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. During this period of evil acts and evil orders and people carried them out, did you experience any significant acts of compassion or caring or goodness?
Frankly, in one simple word, no. It's very hard to explain. The position we were in, all we saw is the cruelty and the brutality, okay? There was no humanity involved. There was one particular case, in my case, that I could honestly will tell you. Remember I mentioned about the trestles, we were waiting for a train? There's one time we had a new captain of the guard. He was the head of the guards that were taking us from place to place. And you have to remember one thing. I was like about 15. Out of my whole town, I was the only 15 that returned from the boys. There were a couple of people, about 4 other boys. There were 16. That means that everybody, that means 5 of us totally that were 15 and 16 that survived out of about 40 kids. All the kids that were born in my age group, in my year, none of them came back. They were all killed in Auschwitz immediately. So it was, it's just hard to explain. But in this, why I didn't see any kindness. But in this particular case, this captain, one day, because the reason I tried to explain to you, I was small, I was not big, and this captain, one day he would pass by in a hurry, and he had a piece of bread, and he shoved it to me, okay? Because I was like a kid compared to a grown-up. And that was the only time that something like this happened, but I don't remember ever seeing him again. But the fact of the matter is, I remember the particular incident, okay? That's about all I could tell you. All the rest of them, it's what used to bother me as a human being, and still does, that it wasn't even that they were nasty and they did what they did. But somehow, when you looked at them, it's like they enjoyed it, okay? But then I will go even further. I found out that people are people. You know, we talk about, you know, like we used to think about the Germans. I used to see the Hungarians do exactly the same thing because they were in a certain power or a certain political mode or a certain, what do you call it, that they were acting the same way. Like I mentioned to you, the Hungarian troops on the front, how they were taking, and by the way, in Budapest, the very end of the war, I know I have friends that they lost their brother, like one girl, she had a 7-year-old brother. They lived in Budapest at the time. They didn't get to Auschwitz, but they were throwing the people in the river. And all the children that they could get a hold of, they threw them in the river. The Danube was loaded with bodies, okay? These were not German, they were Hungarian. And you could go to a lot of these countries where the Nazis occupied. They committed the same atrocities. But I could only speak about the atrocities that I know of, okay? So to say that some of them were nice, I'm sure there must have been some, I don't know.
You didn't see.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'll tell you, along the same line, I'll give you a little idea. Not long ago, the museum got a hold of some film from Auschwitz. The Germans always consider themselves very sophisticated, very educated, and they liked Wagner and very musical and all that. The museum got a hold of some film that was made by somebody. They were not supposed to film that, but one of the people that was there in the group did film it. After they did all this work in Auschwitz and the killing camp, they would go home in the evening, have Wagner on a Victrola, and they would have strawberries with cream, and the children were clean and nice, and they were a loving parent. They were nice. They had a very normal, nice life with beautiful china. All this was recorded, and it shows you that, mind you, they were able to do this all day and come home and act so normal. They were loving fathers, loving wives, whatever, loving husbands. And when you see this, you ask yourself, what kind of people were they? Okay? So I have no explanation. Yes?
Last question.
To what do you attribute your
luck. That's about all I could say. I was not smarter or more heroic than anybody else. It's just a matter of some people did, some people didn't. You know, like I mentioned, I had a brother. He was 7 years older. He was like good, healthy, strong fella. He was just not afraid of anything. He survived almost at the very end of he disappeared, the very end of the war. Okay. So I don't know. I still don't know what happened to him.
The reason the 32nd annual series is entitled Barriers and Boundaries is because despite all the barriers that Mr. Weiss encountered, the one boundary he did not cross was that he did not lose his humanity. And because of that, we are all better for it. Join me in thanking him one more time.